This hearing on the Department of Defense's fiscal year 2021 budget, and I certainly welcome Deputy Secretary for DOD, David Norquist. Thank you for being here today. I'll now yield myself 5 minutes for an opening statement. Defense spending makes up more than half of all discretionary spending. I'll yield myself 5 minutes for an opening statement. Defense spending makes up more than half of all discretionary spending. So it is critical that the Budget Committee fully understand the Department's budget proposal and what it means for the future. While we already have a budget in place for fiscal year 2021, we owe it to the taxpayers and our men and women in uniform to take a comprehensive look at our security needs and provide oversight of the defense budget. To that end, I'd like to welcome back Deputy Secretary Norquist. I'm glad to have DOD back before our committee for a second year in a row after a long hiatus. We have a responsibility to provide the necessary resources to defend this country, and that includes maintaining a military that is second to none. However, our national security involves more than our military. Our country has long understood that an effective national security strategy requires a whole-of-government approach, including diplomacy and foreign aid to prevent war and broker peace in times of conflict, law enforcement to keep our communities safe, oversight to protect our food supply, our air, and our water, innovation in science and technology to keep our edge over competitors, programs to mitigate the destabilizing effects of climate change and prepare against pandemics, and investments in education and infrastructure to keep the economy, the source of our strength, growing. If we are to truly commit to strong national security, the conversation needs to include all the agencies and programs that keep us safe. The budget levels we agreed to last year under the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2019 embody the undeniable connection between non-defense and defense investments. I thought the President finally understood this as well, considering he signed the bill into law, to investments critical to our national and economic security. As a prime example, this budget cuts the funding for the State Department by nearly 1/4 compared with the 2020 enacted level. This is irresponsible and short-sighted. And you don't have to take it from me. The President's own former Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, famously said, "If you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition." Diplomatic operations, international narcotics control and law enforcement, humanitarian aid, disease prevention and control, and education all face destructive and reckless cuts. While the coronavirus spreads around the world and here in the United States, we clearly see how human health is interconnected and a global concern. Despite this reality, the President's budget cuts funding for global health programs by $3 billion, or 34% below the 2020 enacted level. The Department of Defense has consistently identified climate change as a national security challenge and threat multiplier. But the President's budget not only fails to take the scale of the threat seriously, it does not even incorporate the costs of climate change into the budget. At home, U.S. military facilities, operations, and equipment are vulnerable to storms, sea level rise, flooding, wildfires, and drought. And abroad, climate change exacerbates international instability and stands to increase the frequency, scale, complexity, and cost of future DOD missions. We must be ready. Moreover, the President's budget includes major gaps between funding and plans. This shows a lack of strategy that will result in inefficient military spending and a less effective military if not corrected. To be clear, I do not support all of the provisions of the Pentagon's National Defense Strategy, but setting our military up to fail is not only wasteful, it's potentially dangerous. Finally, this proposal defaults on the budget agreement and sets the stage for funding battles with Congress and more continuing resolutions. We ask our troops to perform a very difficult job, but it is made harder if we fail to come through on time with the proper resources in the right accounts. Thankfully, the Senate Majority Leader indicated that he believes in the budget we already have in place and will stick to it. Deputy Secretary Norquist, I realize the tremendous responsibility shouldered by you and your department. Securing the safety of the American people and maintaining the best interests of our service members is no easy job, especially when you are operating under the direction of a president who often gets his security briefings from cable news and puts his personal whims above our national security. We are all concerned by the President's politically motivated and brazen reprogramming of military funds for the border, for his border wall pet project. I have no doubt this not only makes your job harder, but it makes it harder for those who put on the uniform and sacrifice for this country every day. Once again, I thank you for being here today, and I look forward to your testimony. I now yield 5 minutes to the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this hearing. Thank you, Deputy Secretary Norquist, for being here today. We're here to discuss the President's budget request for the DOD for fiscal 21. This is the agency tasked with defending our values, keeping America strong, free, and safe. Providing for the common defense is, in my judgment, our highest constitutional duty. It's a responsibility so great that it's enshrined in the preamble of our founding document. Congress plays an essential role in ensuring full-spectrum military readiness and the security of the American people. We hold the power of the purse, and it's this authority that funds the federal government, including DOD. While we do everything possible to work with the department and we take their views and concerns seriously, it is ultimately up to the Congress to determine how taxpayer dollars are spent on national priorities. This congressional will is expressed through our annual appropriations bills, and those are the law. As the ranking member of this committee and a member of the Appropriations Subcommittee on Defense, I was disappointed that the executive branch chose to substitute its judgment for that of Congress last month when it announced that it would be transferring funds out of DOD accounts. I expect we will hear more about that decision later today, but let me be clear. According to the Constitution, Congress alone is responsible for determining funding for the national defense. With that said, I'm now going to turn to the President's request for the national defense budget, which is why we're here today. After several years of funding instability, this administration has taken the steps to restore the readiness of our military and provide our troops with the tools and training they need. With President Trump's support, Congress passed legislation providing $685 billion for the Department of Defense in fiscal 19, $718 billion in fiscal 20. As a result of these increases, the Department of Defense has been able to rebuild key areas that were neglected under the previous administration, such as procuring new equipment and ensuring military readiness, critical components of a strong national defense. The President's 21 request continues to prioritize funding for key defense needs while adhering to the spending caps called for in the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2019. The Department continues to improve readiness and invest in modernizing our military for the future. This budget makes important investments in nuclear weapons, space, and cyber. It advances the development of critical technologies like hypersonics, artificial intelligence, and microelectronics. This budget also prioritizes our service members with a 3% pay raise, making sure we're not just investing in weapons and technology, but also in our men and women in uniform. While it is critical to fully fund the needs of the Department of Defense, we must also ensure taxpayer dollars are well spent. And I commend you, Mr. Norquist, and this administration for completing its first full financial statement audit in fiscal 18 and recently completing its fiscal year 2019 audit. Both audits are strong steps in the right direction, ensuring transparency and fiscal responsibility within the nation's largest agency. Past administrations have made commitments to conduct this type of review, but the Trump administration is the first to fulfill that promise. I further applaud you, Mr. Secretary, for conducting a comprehensive review of defense-wide organizations we commonly know as the Fourth Estate, where you identified nearly $6 billion in savings for fiscal year 21. Every single federal agency should mirror your efforts to eradicate waste and inefficiency. I look forward to hearing how you were able to successfully find these savings and your plans to continue such reviews going forward, as well as how Congress can support these efforts. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
I thank the ranking member for his statement. In the interest of time, if any other members have opening statements, you may submit those statements in writing for the record. And now, once again, I introduce Deputy Secretary of the Department of Defense, David Norquist. You have 5 minutes to present your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Womack, distinguished members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to testify in support of the President's fiscal year 2021 budget request for the Department of Defense. Before I do, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the 2 Marines killed Sunday in combat in Iraq. Please keep these men and their families in your thoughts and prayers. The men and women of the Department of Defense put their lives on the line every day for the safety and security of the nation. We are humbled and grateful for their sacrifice. To begin, let's consider the state of defense at the beginning of this administration. DOD had been operating for 5 years under destructive spending caps, which left the department with significant funding shortfalls and resulted in the smallest military force since 1940, key munitions shortages, low readiness ratings in key combat units, and an urgent need to rebuild our nuclear deterrent. At the same time, we were grappling with a new warfighting environment, given the reemergence of great power competition from Russia and China and the rapidly changing character of warfare. Future wars will be waged not just in the air, on the land, and at sea, but also in space and cyberspace, dramatically increasing the complexity of warfare. To address this, we developed a new national defense strategy that shifted the department's focus to the high-end fight. Thanks to President Trump's commitment to rebuild the military and a bipartisan effort in Congress, over the past 3 years, the department received the significant funding increase it needed to implement the National Defense Strategy. As a result, the department made important progress along the NDS's 3 lines of effort. For example, regarding readiness and lethality, the Department of Defense has increased the number of Ready Brigade combat teams by 33% and raised the readiness of the Air Force's lead pacing squadrons by 35%. We also restructured the department around the new character of warfare. Working with Congress, we established the Space Force, elevated U.S. Cyber Command, and created the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center. Regarding our alliances, our NATO allies have increased their contribution to our collective security by $130 billion since FY 2016. Finally, along the third line of effort, reform, the Secretary of Defense led a defense-wide review that has identified aggressive reform opportunities that would result in over $5.7 billion in fiscal year 21 savings. The FY 2021 budget request is the next step in implementing the National Defense Strategy, and the focus is on all domain operations. It addresses the challenges of today by first, sustaining readiness and keeping faith with our 2.2 million military members and their families, and second, preparing for the challenges of tomorrow by recapitalizing our nuclear deterrence, strengthening homeland missile defense, and expanding our investment in critical emerging technologies, such as hypersonic weapons, directed energy, 5G, microelectronics, artificial intelligence, and autonomous platforms. At $740.5 billion for the national defense, of which $705 billion is for the Department of Defense, this budget is different from the previous few years because the DOD top line is flat, with no growth for inflation. This meant that we had to make additional tough choices and major cuts in some areas in order to free up money to continue to invest in preparing for the high-end fight. In closing, although defense spending is sizable, it is at near record lows as a percentage of the economy and federal spending. Defense spending is now at 3.1% of GDP, down from 11% in 1953 and 4.5% in 2010, and at 15% of federal spending, down from 57% in 1952 and about 20% in 2008. This foundation of security, however, is what makes everything else possible. I appreciate this committee's support for the men and women of our armed forces, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you for your statement. We will now begin our question and answer period. As a reminder, members can submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and Deputy Secretary Norquist's answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. Any members who wish to submit questions for the record may do so within 7 days. As we usually do, the ranking member and I will defer our questions until the end. And I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Doggett, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your service. I advised your office in advance last night of concerns I have about coronavirus. I represent Military City, USA, San Antonio, Texas. My district is adjacent to Joint Base San Antonio at Lackland, where we've already hosted 2 plane loads of Americans evacuated from exposure to coronavirus. This afternoon or tomorrow, the Trump administration is apparently flying additional plane loads to San Antonio of people that have never been tested that are on the Grand Princess cruise ship without a very clear plan of what happens to those who test positive once they get to San Antonio. While I certainly want to assist all Americans, my concern is protecting my civilian population neighbors in San Antonio and, of course, every one of our military service members. I realize that it is not the Defense Department decision, though it is indeed an incredible decision that the Trump administration has chosen not to test any of these people before they leave California. I realize that it's not the Defense Department's decision, but the Trump administration's failure to get San Antonio more than 75 lab tests as of today. I realize it's not the Department of Defense decision, but a Trump administration failure to provide San Antonio additional protective medical equipment for our professional medical people. But my understanding is that it is within your jurisdiction to decide whether those individuals who test positive for coronavirus must immediately leave any Defense Department property. Is that the position of the Defense Department this morning?
So appreciate the question. And again, I understand and appreciate your support of our responsibility to help bring Americans safely home and quarantine them. So far, what the Department of Defense has been is we function in support of HHS. We provide the rooms to their specifications that allow us to quarantine individuals. We work with HHS on where they go from there. I know the Secretary's in discussions with HHS about the concern that you have raised. The challenges that we face on the department side is severalfold. One is we have a very large force that we have to have prepared to fight tonight, and a relatively small medical community upon which to rely. And so,
and I understand all that and certainly appreciate and agree with you. My only question is it the Defense Department policy as of this morning that if anyone who I think should have been tested before they ever came to San Antonio gets there and they test positive but are otherwise asymptomatic and don't need treatment, are they being compelled to leave Defense Department property immediately upon a result of positive test?
That is my understanding of our current policy.
And you made reference to discussions between different parts of the Trump administration. Has Health and Human Services, has Secretary Azar and his people with CDC, have they requested that the Defense Department make an exception to this policy for these evacuees who are positive but not symptomatic?
So I don't know in terms of in the last 24 hours if there's been a request.
I was told they did it on earlier plane loads, but I haven't got any results of that. That's why I'm inquiring this morning.
I don't know about on this plane request.
As you know, in San Antonio, we're proud of the fact that we have some of the best military medical facilities in the world. At Brooke Army Medical Center that we refer to as BAMSI, at Wilford Hall at Lackland. Is the Defense Department declining to permit anyone who has coronavirus from being treated in isolation in those military hospitals?
I don't know about those particular military hospitals. In general, we have treatment facilities for if a DOD person affected, but when our hospitals are generally not set up and there are congressional laws that restrict and affect our ability to bring private citizens in, and so I'd have to defer in terms of
if there is any law that you think stands in the way of treating these evacuees that have been forced on the city of San Antonio without good plans, without protective equipment, without the test having been done, I would really appreciate your office telling me what it is today. My understanding is it's Defense Department policy, and I respect that because I want to protect every service member so that they are ready to defend our country. But the problem is that moving evacuees who have coronavirus across San Antonio to local hospitals and other unknown destinations, since they don't know where they're even going to put these people once they're forced off the military reservation, is something that risks community spread in our community. And none of these evacuees have been previously tested. They may be asymptomatic, but they could well be, as has been true of some of the earlier flights, they could be positive and transmit this virus to others. I would really appreciate your going back. I know our city has appealed. I believe that our governor as well has raised this concern to see if there isn't a way to contain these people in the same hotels they've been sitting in. You've got some people that will be there today or tomorrow who probably are positive for coronavirus if the administration had bothered to test them in California. They will be there already, posing whatever danger they pose. The problem is when we start moving them all across Bexar County from one side of town to another and the danger that poses. And that's That's our great concern, and I appreciate your leadership, and I would just appeal to you to go back and see if there isn't a way to keep those individuals there without posing any real danger to our forces. Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Deputy Secretary Norquist. I appreciate you coming to talk to us today about the President's FY 2021 defense budget request. You know, as a Air Force veteran of nearly 27 active years, I applaud DOD's efforts to identify $5.7 billion in savings for FY 2021 and to reinvest these savings in critical national defense strategy priorities, including nuclear deterrence, cyber and space, and technological developments. However, even though I applaud and support border security and the building of a border wall, I am concerned about the administration pulling funds from DOD weapons programs to fund the construction of the wall. In FY 2019, the administration used reprogramming authority and a national emergency declaration, which I supported, to reapportion $6.7 billion to fund the border wall. Last month, we learned that the Pentagon would be reprogramming $3.8 billion in FY 2020 appropriations from various DOD weapons programs to fund the border wall. Having traveled to the El Paso sector of the U.S. Border Patrol, I wholeheartedly support strengthening our southern border, including building the border wall. However, I do have serious concerns with pulling funding from DOD weapons programs for its construction. I was particularly disappointed to see $360 million reprogrammed that was to be used for additional C-130J aircraft. The FY 20 National Defense Authorization Act specifically authorized funding for 4 additional C-130Js. These additional aircraft would be invaluable in supporting missions such as the 910th Airlift Wing at Youngstown Air Reserve Station, which operates DOD's only large area fixed wing aerial spray mission, forcing the 910th to simultaneously support dual primary missions with only 8 primary aircraft. There is no question that my colleagues and I are concerned about the diversion of military funds from these various weapons programs to fund the border wall. But there is a solution. We must not forget that Congress has a constitutional duty to appropriate funding, and it is Congress's failure to approve the necessary funding to secure our borders that has forced President Trump to divert funding from DOD to build the wall. Therefore, Congress must provide adequate funding for the border wall so that the administration is not forced to pull these and other valuable DOD funds. So, Deputy Secretary Norquist, can you tell me how much funding for DOD's budget is geared towards future conflicts? You and I talked about that a little bit before we began the hearing.
So we've invested significantly in future conflicts. When you think about our budget, you sort of divide procurement, which is readiness, O&M, which is sort of the near-term readiness, and the investment in today. You have the procurement, which is systems at field over the next several years. And then you have RDT&E, which is research, development, test, and evaluation. In this budget, about $106.6 billion. Those are really the next generation of technologies. In nominal dollars, it's the largest RDT&E budget we have had. But I think what it reflects is even in a time of a lower top line, a tight top line, it is still a priority for the department to be ready, not just for the challenges of today, but the important challenges of the future.
Yeah, I agree. Trying to drill down just a little bit more, what are we doing to ensure funding for non-tangibles, such as software, interconnected networks, artificial intelligence, and other critical weapon systems and platforms that you can't necessarily touch and feel?
Right, this is a challenging area because everyone notices the ships, the planes, but behind it you have software, and software can have cybersecurity vulnerabilities. It also can make the biggest difference between two planes that look identical in terms of which one wins in the fight. So we have significant investments both in developing our workforce, the capability to produce those types of technologies, as well as in ensuring the cybersecurity aspects of those platforms. And in addition, working with the supply chain. One of the issues is helping secure the businesses that are suppliers to DOD so their technology is not stolen.
Okay. You know, since FY 2002, DOD has operated under a continuing resolution 14 times. Shame on Congress. Shame on my colleagues for not being willing to put forth a budget proposal so that we can fix this broken budget process and appropriate the money to DOD to provide our national security. So can you elaborate just a little bit? How do CRs affect the department's ability to plan in the short and long term?
CR is a significant problem. Let me walk just through a couple of issues. The first is they prevent new starts. So if we have a technology that the department recommends and the House and Senate both agree and Republicans and Democrats think are valuable, we can't start it on 1 October. We have to wait. So each year you give the other team 3 to 4 months head start every time you're under CR because you're delaying these new technologies. Same thing with production increases. There's a factory that's scaled to go from 50 to 100, but it has to operate at 50 inefficiently at extra cost to the taxpayer until the budget passes and allows them to go up to the 100 that the Congress authorized and appropriated and the department supported. The real risk to this over time is the department gets so used to it, it just moves its contracts to the spring and builds a 6-month delay because it just assumes it will not get the budget on time. So in a government where speed and efficiency is always a challenge and you're trying to push, the CR pushes things to be slower and more inefficient and wasteful.
Sure. We don't run families that way. We don't run businesses that way. We shouldn't run our nation that way. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Yep. Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, the Vice Chairman of the committee, Mr. Moulton, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Deputy Secretary, thank you very much for the critical work that you do to keep our nation safe and to serve our men and women in uniform. It's incredibly important. And I also want to commend 2 fellow veterans on this committee, the ranking member, Mr. Womack, and my friend, Mr. Johnson, for really having the political courage, which is difficult these days, to raise the constitutional issues with what Mr. Trump has done to reprogram congressionally appropriated funds to pay for his border wall. I want to get into that a bit. Now, some Republicans have said that it's the Congress's failure to adequately fund the border wall that has forced President Trump to move funds to build his wall. Mr. Norquist, DOD has not identified building a southern border wall as a national security priority, although it has identified climate change as a national security priority. Now, I'm a Democrat. I believe Congress has failed to appropriate funds to deal with climate change and climate security. If President Obama had unilaterally moved money from building Navy ships and C-130s and other defense priorities to address climate change, would that be an action that you would support?
So I think each president and each Congress has to work through these issues. The question for the climate change is under what authority. The thing that created this unusual is the Department of Defense has actually been given direct authority by Congress under Section 284 to build barriers along the wall. Typically, we would not have legal authority to be involved in this business. It's normally a DHS mission. I don't go with regard to climate change. We certainly make our bases more resilient against.
So I can agree that you have the authority to build the wall if those funds are appropriated by Congress. But do you believe you have the constitutional authority to move appropriated funds from one account to another against the wishes of Congress?
So we have the authority under reprogramming laws passed by Congress that allows the Department of Defense to move money from one account to another. Now, traditionally, we have done this with the consent of the committees, and this is the issue that you're highlighting, which is legally it's only a notification, and so therefore the presidents have always had the ability to move this, but in practice we have done this as a notification. And
well, the president has
creates the challenge.
And I would definitely agree with you that it is a challenge, it's a constitutional challenge, which is significant, and you agree.
It can be, yes.
The president has clearly identified construction of the southern border wall as a significant national security concern. How would you rank the construction of the border wall against DOD national security priorities, Mr. Norquist?
So Homeland Security has always been a part of our concern, and border security is part of national security. So when
would you rank it higher than building a 355-ship Navy?
We have to balance across a series of requirements, and so in this case, we were asked and directed to support the Department of Homeland Security.
Right, but you're the Deputy Secretary. Would you rank it higher than building a 355-ship Navy?
So let me put it this way. When I was at the Department of Homeland Security, I would have. When I'm at the Department of Defense, I tend to balance within the Department of Defense. But this is why the President and others who look across set priorities that we support.
Well, I serve on the Armed Services Committee as well, and Acting Secretary Thomas Modley told us that this reprogramming plan is, quote, not helpful. Not helpful. So is President Trump or the Secretary of the Navy correct?
So the key here, and I think this is something that I should start by making clear to everyone, this is not how we would have asked to do this. It is not how the President asked to fund the wall. Right? The President asked directly for funds. We, the department, had supported that. What happened was in the law that was enacted in December, it left the authorities with the President to move the money, but only if it was done within DOD accounts. And so, while some people supported the wall and some didn't, the compromise left this mechanism in place. So when it came to us, the question was to try and find sources that supported it.
I understand the President's put you in a difficult position, but the bottom line is that we are supposed to follow the Constitution. And I think that should be important. You know, China began construction of its Great Wall in the 7th century BCE. More recently, Chinese national and local government spending has been focused on artificial intelligence and other advanced capabilities. Some of the same things that you mentioned, you're changing the focus of our budget on. You know, it looks to me that about 6% of the total funding that you've dedicated to the border wall is what we're investing in AI. And that compares to tens of billions of dollars that China is investing in artificial intelligence. Who's right?
So the Chinese have put a significant investment. The department is trying to grow its capability. One of the issues is we have been investing there, but we have to build out the capacity and the skill set to make sure we use that money wisely. I would certainly like to invest more over time as we grow the skill of the workforce and the projects that would sustain those initiatives.
Well, I would just point out that while we're waiting for that to grow over time, China's beating us, and we need to catch up.
China's a major challenge on these.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Hearn, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Womack, and Deputy Secretary Norquist for being here today. It's an important hearing that we're having, and you know, I'd like to define this as the House Budget Committee's third meeting where the Democrats insult the president's budget to no end without offering their own budget, as they're required to do by law. And I just want to read this because the Vice Chairman made a comment about the Constitution. This is what's really defined in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8. It gives the power of Congress to lay and collect taxes, duties, and imports and excises. The Constitution allows Congress to tax in order. So we're sitting here talking about a budget that the President put forth his constitutional duty that the House has not done. And we just need to remind ourselves what the Constitution actually says. And so let's establish a timeline here. Before President Trump's election, the Department of Defense has never performed a full financial audit. Trump was elected, delivered on his campaign promise, and the largest audit ever undertaken by the federal government was completing. In fact, you all recently completed the fiscal year 2019 audit as well, and President Trump likes to call this the Promises Plus. Both audits are proven steps in the right direction, ensuring transparency and fiscal responsibility within the nation's largest agency. The department closed more than 500 notices of findings and recommendations issued in the 2018 audit. Cleaning up our books and ensuring that we have a lean, transparent, and robust Department of Defense is exactly how we achieve peace through strength. So my questions are, and I think we can all agree that the Pentagon conducting financial audits is a positive move for our country. So Deputy Secretary Norquist, can you explain to the committee how the audit findings are driving change at the Pentagon and provide some specific examples?
I'd be delighted to. And again, thank you and thank this committee for your emphasis and support of the audit. So the audit's driven change in a number of ways. The first is just in savings, right? When we did the audit, we discovered, we do inventory. The audit is not just a paperwork drill. They go and they open warehouses, they look at supplies, they pull out samples and they test them. And so we found places where there were items in inventory, many times known to the local but not to across the services because it was in the database, that freed up $167 million worth of supplies. Put those back into inventory, able to close out requirements. Some of these were items people were waiting on back order for, didn't know that a different base already had it and they could have had access to it. Immediate savings there. We've had other places where we've been able to automate using bots to save manual labor as we go through this process. But I think part of the addition to those savings, which are substantial as we go through the reforms, is the long-term benefit, which is private sector firms have access to timely and accurate data, and they use it to drive decision-making. In the Department of Defense, we are building out our data analytics capability as we have this, and this lets us run Defense Logistics Agency more efficiently. allows us to make better use of this in decision-making on property and other items. So significant benefit to the department. I appreciate the committee's support. It is driving both near-term savings and long-term reform.
Thank you. In recent years, Iran and other enemies of the United States have been investing heavily in building cyber defenses and cyber attack capabilities. I saw that the President's budget calls for almost $10 billion for offensive and defensive cyber capabilities, which obviously is great for our nation. In a global and interconnected world, it's becoming ever more important to invest in safeguarding our DOD networks and information systems. How does this budget build on the progress made in the military cyber operations?
So it does three things. First of all, it strengthens Cyber Command, both their offensive and defensive capability, and they are certainly the lead for this. The second is it gives us visibility over our networks and allows us to be stronger in defending. In addition, we're working with our companies and through the supply chain, through what we call CMMC, to help the vendors who work with the department protect the technology that they have from China stealing it or from cyber attacks.
Thank you. And just from a remaining minute here, could you compare the President's budget to the current Democrat budget for this?
So I'm not familiar with the Democrats' budget.
What? So, you know, as we go forward, I hope that my colleagues will be as ever critical of the fact that they haven't produced a budget as they are about the President's budget that he has produced. A lot of talk about constitutionality around here, as I read Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, the very first power we're supposed to be doing in Congress, and we're woefully failing at that job. I appreciate you being here. I appreciate all the hard work that you've done since you've been at the DOD, and it's what Americans want. They want good use of taxpayer dollars, and thank you so much for all that you do.
Thank you.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Morelli, for 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman and the Ranking Member, for holding this hearing today, and certainly thank you, Deputy Secretary Norquist, for being here today. As I think we've identified, the defense budget is 15% of all federal spending, and that encompasses a vast array of programs that the nation depends on for stability, resiliency, and to continue to be a leader on the world stage. So with that much of our federal spend, obviously there's a great deal to talk about, but I'd like to spend my few moments on a topic both critical to the nation and frankly important to and significant to my district in Rochester, New York, and that's the industrial base of our nation and whether or not we can continue to meet our defense needs. DOD relies on a wide-ranging and complex industrial base for the products and services that enable our warfighting capabilities. The U.S. military is respected worldwide, but I'm concerned the industrial base is beginning to fall behind in the United States, and we need to make significant investments to ensure that the industrial base and our supply chain are prepared to meet the nation's challenges. I have worked with a number of DOD officials who are focusing on this effort, and I appreciate that, and I want to make sure that we continue looking forward to meet that need. So could you just briefly, because I do have a few questions, and I know we're short on time, but if you could just comment on the industrial base, supply chain, what work you think needs to be done to ensure we're preparing our nation's defense capabilities?
I think, as you highlight, the industrial base is absolutely essential. We do not build the airplanes, ships, tanks, and planes. Private citizens and private companies assemble those and build those for the American taxpayer. They're essential to our success. Their quality is what makes our force competitive on the battlefield. We work very closely with industry. Part is to signal where we're heading so they can invest in the right future technologies. Part is helping them, as I mentioned before, secure themselves so their technology isn't stolen by competitors. But these investments are essential to our long-term success and their health and again, you need enough to have competition is essential to our long-term success.
So are you concerned at all with supply chain interruptions? Have you seen potential threats to the supply chain and the industrial base in your sites? What steps is the department taking to address those?
So Ellen Lord from Acquisition and Sustainment is our lead for this. They're focused on following the supply chain, understanding both the potential for foreign technologies or equipment such as Huawei to make sure that that doesn't enter the supply chain. Also worried about the security of the companies, making sure their information isn't disrupted. But making sure we can follow and secure our supply chain is a key part, and we have a number of initiatives they're working on to do that.
And I would like to continue to partner with folks to make sure that we continue to support that. I also wanted to talk just a little bit about the longevity of the skilled workforce. I'm blessed in Rochester, a long history with Kodak, Xerox, Bausch & Lomb, and dozens and dozens of other innovative technology companies for decades. have prepared a high-skilled workforce. But obviously, the nation's technical workforce is shrinking, particularly with retirements due to baby boomers hitting retirement age. Can you tell me about the steps you're taking along with regard to workforce development, so it sort of aligns with the supply chain and industrial base, but it is a little different? You have specific initiatives within the department to address that?
So we do, and let me highlight one of them within science and technology areas. We have a $100 million investment in STEM, because when you look at the areas where technology is heading and the type of investments we need, we have workforce education and outreach programs to help develop that workforce, recruit that workforce, and keep it in the Department of Defense, because we will continue to depend on those technologies and those skilled people.
Finally, I know that while sensitive materials are all made in the United States, there are some commoditized products, I think, that come overseas in the defense supply chain. Could you just comment on what impact, if any, the COVID-19 is having, and what steps you're taking to address that?
So we're looking at that. Luckily, we do not depend on very much that comes directly out of China because of the way the Department of Defense is structured, but we are concerned as it spreads to other countries, allies, and partners, and what the effect of technology and production disruptions would be. For example, there's an F-35 facility in Europe, and so the question is, do those production schedules stay on time?
And
so
do you have a task force? Have you developed something to look at those?
So again, Ellen Lord from ANS, she's the one who is looking at those. She and I talked about this the other day. So far, there's in most of the places, there's been very little disruption to date, but if this thing continues and expands, then we'll potentially see some issues, and we need to stay on top of those.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Smith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Deputy Secretary, for being here today. Today marks 36 days until this committee needs to pass a budget. I've always thought for some time that the thought of this committee doing their job and preparing a budget and passing it was a bipartisan issue. Last week, Mr. Chairman, I was proven that it is a bipartisan issue. And I was very pleased to see that 17 of your Democrat colleagues and my colleagues sent you a letter requesting that the Budget Committee does their job and presents a budget, passes a budget. And I would like to offer that into the record, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to offer this letter that was submitted to you by 17 Democrat members in regards to passing a budget.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do want to highlight a couple provisions within this letter. I think it's pretty important. It says producing an annual budget is a necessary first step toward reducing the skyrocketing deficit, and that the American people cannot afford for the Budget Committee to abandon its responsibility to produce a budget, end quote. They added the American people need more than just spending limits, that a budget provides a framework for Congress to review our country's fiscal state. I couldn't have said it better myself. This is a time that I agree wholeheartedly with these 17 Democrats. It's unfortunate that the last few weeks we've heard so much criticism of the president's budget. When various cabinet secretaries and deputy secretaries have came into this room, they've criticized the president's budget, but yet they have not even prepared a budget for themselves. We have the president's budget, which the president has filed every year according to his obligation. The Democrat majority has yet to file one budget since they've been in power, last year or this year. The Republicans, even though we're not in the majority, we have a budget. So if you don't like the president's budget, feel free to use the Republican Study Committee budget. It's just an option. Nancy Pelosi has said it numerous times that a budget is a statement of your values. Show us your values. I just repeat that same comment to Speaker Pelosi and the House Democrats. Let's see your budget. Show us your values. Unfortunately, I think they would probably bankrupt the country if they showed us their values. And that's why they're not doing a budget. Budget also we're an uncertain appropriations process where there's more likely that there will be a continuing resolution in September. Deputy Secretary, what does a continuing resolution do to the military?
A continuing resolution is very destructive to the military. And let's just use an example of a depot, right? You've got a workforce. They can see that there's a demand signal coming, but they don't know whether to hire more people and increase their capacity for the work that's coming or whether to wait because there may be a CR and that work may wait 3 or 4 months. And so the effect for the department is disruptive, but the disruption to the men and women out there who work in these companies and who respond to these demand signals, they're the ones who are not getting their jobs, who are not getting disrupted. And then the department has a delay in the maintenance of our equipment because of that disruption in those companies.
I totally agree. By not planning ahead, it clearly hurts our troops. And it's because Congress is not doing their job in passing a budget, going through the irregular appropriations process. Hopefully, we can get our act together. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but since President Trump was elected, he has invested in rebuilding our military. He has secured nearly $2.2 trillion in funding in his first 3 years in office, destroyed the ISIS caliphate, bringing down its leader and saving countless American lives in the process. And he has stood up for freedom across the world. Taking that into consideration, would you say that our troops have the resources they and their families need more so than they did 4 years ago?
We are in a very different place than we were in 4 years ago. The readiness of our forces are up, the quantity of munitions they have is up, the training level's up, and on top of all of that, the investment in prepared for future conflicts is also being taken care of and addressed.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Peters, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I did want to make some comments about this budget proposal, but I do want to say that one shining light in this is the funding for the congressionally directed fix for military survivors suffering from the widow's tax. I've worked on this for years, and I'd like to offer a note of gratitude for Chairman Yarmouth for his leadership on this issue, which was very important to him and a priority. Two things. One is, I get this notion that my colleagues on the other side are concerned about us not having a budget. I would note that we went through an appropriations process, and we came up with a deal, and the House approved it, the Senate approved it, the President signed it, and he went based on a phony emergency declaration, reprogrammed $6 billion on his own to a wall. I hope my Republican colleagues will join me in their, will take that outrage they have over the congressional purview over the budget and join me and make sure that that kind of stuff doesn't happen again. This is not a kingdom. It is a divided government. Congress has its role, and the appropriations that we made deserve to be honored, and I hope that next time this happens that my colleagues who express such concern about Congress's power will stand with me to make sure that those are observed. And then, Mr. Secretary, I also I did want to note, too, that I, too, appreciate the role of the private sector in providing us the equipment that is so important to our mission and to our warfighters. I have to say that in that light, it's disappointing to see how some of these cuts have been proposed. A Navy TAO oiler that we need to sustain the operational tempo and have our sailors meet their missions in the Pacific and elsewhere. Cutting unmanned systems like the MQ-9 or MQ-1 without notice to the company, by the way. At the same time, the Army is trying to develop the future of unmanned capabilities, but we don't have that yet. And so today we need to continue that continuity. And it does great disservice to the partners we have in the private sector that these continuities are not maintained. And as far as I know, the 12th century technology of a wall is not reflected in the Quadrennial Defense Review or any other military priorities. I did want to ask a question, though, about ships. I agree with the President and others that we need to attain a 355-ship Navy. But it's not just getting to 355, it's about getting to 355 with the right ships, ones that combat our adversaries with new technology and lethality. How do the cuts in this budget ensure success and that ensure that efficiency is driving the process instead of would appear to be politics.
So first of all, there's two sets of trades going on within the shipbuilding budget. The first is the Navy leadership, both military and civilian, looked at the challenges with getting the current fleet to sea and realigned additional money on O&M into maintenance and repair, so the fleet they have is ready to go. That required them to make some trade-offs with regard to ship construction, as did the fact that because we don't have inflation in the budget, we're down about $13 billion. Those created some tight trade-offs. What we're looking at going forward with the Navy, and the Secretary has directed me to lead a study working with the Navy and others, is, as you point out, what's the right ship mix? Is it necessarily the case that we keep building the exact same designs we have today, or as technology evolves and the ships of the future and changes evolves, how do we survive in an anti-axis area denial environment that we may see in the Pacific? So we'll be doing that analysis. We'll run them through war games and simulations between several different designs and be able to present that and go through that in the spring, early summer.
I look forward to that. It's nice to have dreams of new technology being used for the national security. In the meantime, we have actual missions to complete, and I think the abruptness with which some of these changes are made is not of best service to the nation and to our warfighters. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and now recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Burchett, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. Thank you, sir, for being here. I know you've already answered this, but if you could just break it down a little further, how does the instability of the budget process affect the DOD? You know, we've done 14 continued resolutions.
So I think one of the things to look at is, it is maybe a way to understand it. When I have meetings, we had 1 year where we had the appropriation on time, and I had a meeting and people said, you don't need to tell us what to do under CR. You have to tell us what to do if it actually happens on time, because so few of them had exposure to it. In fact, I looked over my workforce, and a number of them have never really got the exposure to what a normal process looks like that you and I and others who've been in this business used to take for granted. The challenge then becomes the system builds that delay into its process. And think about it. We bring on 270,000 or so new people each year to the Department of Defense who require training. This disruption on when the training is going to occur, on the funding levels, those all create effects throughout the organization. And you want to make sure that the department is keeping pace with the challenges. So when there's an increase in production for a system, we don't want it to wait 3, 4, 5 months. And so those types of disruptions to our planning are bad. Those are disruptions to the depots and the workforces out there is disruptive. And it just consumes time and energy of people focusing on the incremental contracting when we could have more efficiently contracted in one single step for the entire year.
I'm wondering how that would affect my folks back home, our reservists at McGee Tyson, the air fueling wing they have there.
Well, one of the things that I think happens to the Guard and Reserve that's particularly destructive is we often don't get a CR for the whole time. We get it for a few months and then another month and then another week. Well, on those Saturdays is a Guard mobilization training. And it's Friday afternoon, and we have to tell the Guard, do you show up on Saturday or not? We don't know if there's going to be a shutdown. Well, for those who drive any length of distance, they're driving while the government's not knowing whether it's going to be open, may drive several hours to their training, and then be told to turn around and drive back home. So the multiple CRs in a given year has a really disruptive effect on the Guard and the Reserve when they're trying to show up for mobilization dates.
Okay. How could we, as Congress, be more helpful in ensuring that the department is successful in their financial transparency?
So I think with regard to the funding, the CRs getting to regular appropriations on time, with regard to transparency in the audit, there's a couple of things that really make a difference. First of all, has been the vocal support of the Congress for the audit. I came back to the Department of Defense in part because the President had committed to audit the Pentagon for the first time, and I wanted to be part of that. We wouldn't have been there without you and other members of this committee who have emphasized the importance of that. The second thing is there are investments in the budget, and they're not in the dramatic areas, they're in business systems. To get rid of older business systems, replace them with modern compliant ones. Often those don't fare as well in a budget process because they're not dramatic or interesting, but they are important to the efficient operations of the budget. So those sort of factors matter as well. Any of those areas is a big step forward, and again, as always, timely and robust funding is helpful.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, can I ask you a question? last year, did we pass a 2-year budget?
We did pass the Balanced Budget Act of 2019, which provided for 2 years of budgeting.
And are we in the second year of that budget?
We are considering the second year of that budget right now.
So we've already passed the budget.
That's correct.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being with us today. I have a strong interest in shipbuilding, obviously, from being from Southeast Virginia. The Virginia-class submarines, we expect to build 2 this year. The budget only includes enough money for 1. How are we going to get to a 355-ship Navy if we are cutting the budget for shipbuilding?
So the challenge we have, as I discussed before, is twofold. One is the Navy invested in the operating maintenance to keep their fleet going, and we have the flat top line, which drives it down. So that creates some initial challenges. The Virginia-class submarine, just to be clear, is a variable, valuable submarine. It's the type of system that we have invested in the past and intend to continue to buy well into the future as a key platform in the Pacific fight. But as we start to head to 355, we need to look at not necessarily the submarines, but in other areas, what is the right mix of platforms to be ready for that future challenge?
Well, one of the ways we save money is to make multiple ship purchases, so you can save money. Have contracts been signed for 2 ships this year?
I believe there is a contract signed, and it's like a 9+1. I forget the mechanics of it that sets up the multi-year.
The shipyards are acquiring materials and parts and things like that on a multi-ship basis. Aren't they assuming that there will be 2 ships?
I'm not familiar with the details of the contract. My understanding was there was an expectation, there was an option in 1 year, and the other years were 2 a year, but I'd have to defer to our acquisition experts from the Navy.
In terms of the infrastructure at our public yards, about 3 years ago, we developed a shipyard infrastructure optimization plan. Maybe I missed something, but I didn't see any major projects as part of that plan in the budget. What is the plan to actually fulfill the optimization plan?
Let me check with the Navy and get you the answer on that for the record. There was one thing I'd like to highlight, though, for you, because I understand the importance of how do you get to where we want to go in the Navy. One of the reforms that we have introduced in the budget is normally when you spend money in the Navy, you obligate it, and not all of it disperses. You may have a contract, not necessarily a shipbuilding contract, but one that you give it under price, you're able to end it early, you're not happy with the vendor's performance, you cancel it. That money just normally goes back to Treasury. What we have proposed for the Navy is that money goes into ship construction Navy so that the Congress can authorize it for additional ships. Our view is twofold. One is it's an important feature for the nation, but the other is it encourages better behavior of individuals in their spending in the Navy if they can understand that the dollars they save are going to the Navy of the future. So I'd ask you to look at that provision. We'd appreciate your support, but we think it's going to help strengthen and expand the capacity of the shipbuilding yards.
Thank you. You're aware that Norfolk, Virginia is vulnerable to sea level rise. What is the DOD's latest assessment of the challenge of sea level rise in Norfolk, and what are we doing about it?
So again, I don't have the specifics, Norfolk, but we have looked along the East Coast and other areas at what resilience we have to put in for bases, so when there's high water and storms, we don't lose many of our bases, particularly the naval ones, right along the waterfront, and being able to make sure they survive storms and high water areas. And so we have worked on those, and each of the new construction efforts has to meet the standards, the enhanced standards for that resilience.
Are you doing something about the present infrastructure?
I understand that we are in those areas.
Okay. And you asked a question on budget challenges you talked about because of the coronavirus virus. You talked about the supply chain. Are there other challenges that may be occurring because of the virus?
Well, we'll have to see in terms of, we've taken appropriate measures at the Department of Defense to, a lot of this is basic hygiene, it's hand sanitation, it's keeping distances, it's teleworking if you need to have that set up, we'll work on that. But we're going to have to look and see if it begins to expand and spread, what we need to do to keep those production facilities up and running, and what measures and additional ones we need to take.
And how that will affect the budget?
And how that will affect the expenditures in the budget, right.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Muser, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Deputy Secretary. I will yield 30 seconds or as much time as he needs to Ranking Member Johnson.
Thank you. I appreciate the gentleman yielding. I just want to make a point of clarification. I might have misunderstood. Mr. Chairman, we have not passed a budget resolution out of this committee. And we haven't passed a budget out of Congress. We didn't pass one last year, and there's no plan to pass one this year. Out of desperation, we passed a spending plan, but we haven't passed a budget. So I just want to make sure that members and those across America that might be looking at this understand this committee has not passed a budget. I yield back.
Thank you. Deputy Secretary, a colleague seemed to insinuate a little earlier that we are sacrificing our Navy for border security. Are we sacrificing our Navy for border security? Is it one or the other?
It is not one or the other. We are investing in both. We have a responsibility at the Department of Defense to support and protect the nation across a range of threats. DHS has the lead, and we are in support on border security, but we support on Homeland, and we're making investments in shipbuilding. Both of these are a priority.
Has the size of the Navy grown under the current administration versus the previous administration?
Yes, the size of the Navy has grown. I think it started on 275. It's up to 290. It's on its way to 306.
While we're also increasing border security.
Correct.
You were CFO at Department of Homeland Security under Tom Ridge. And would you say that 100,000 undocumented people entering our country illegally every month is a threat to our country?
The migration waves that they had saw before they started the construction of the wall in this administration were dwarfing the numbers that we had seen. Even in bipartisan Republicans and Democrats who had worked at Homeland were commenting on the fact, yes, it's a tangible emergency. I went down to the Rio Grande Valley, met with the Border Patrol agents there. Their comment to me with regard to the wall was, it works. They see the manifestation and its effect, and they're very appreciative both for that, as well as for the men and women of the National Guard who have deployed down there and supported them. They referred to them as a game changer.
And even though the illegals and the number of undocumented people that were crossing our border back when you were the CFO was far less, a very bipartisan bill passed known as the Secure Fence Act, which seemed to make a lot of sense to both Democrats and Republicans at the time. Yet any sort of fencing or border security today seems to catch the wrath of, in a very partisan manner.
Correct. During the previous time, we had significant interest from Congress, bipartisan votes for the Secure Fence Act, expecting the Department of Defense to continue to invest in hundreds of miles of border fencing and barriers along the southwest border.
The American people or anybody with a memory gets very confused over that. So I've got this question for you, please. How does this budget request ensure that the U.S. maintains its competitive edge over China and Russia, particularly in space and cybersecurity?
So this budget does a significant investment in space and cyber. One of the things we have to realize is the emphasis China is placing on technology. They are looking into these two new domains. So one of the things we talk about is everyone used to think of the military fight on the air, land, and sea. You have the Army, Navy, and the Air Force. And what we have seen from our adversaries and rivals is an emphasis on space and cyber as a way to break down our capabilities. The standing up of the Space Force was an essential step in not just increasing the funding, but providing the training, the doctrine, the structure behind understanding what the conflict will look like in space and how to prepare, as was the elevation of Cyber Command. We've invested in both of those. Some of the space stuff is on the classified side, but these have been priority areas for this administration throughout its tenure because of the shift to the new domains and the ability to make sure we can function across all domains.
Excellent. The president recently signed the Afghanistani peace deal, which will phase down troops in Afghanistan, as you know, after 2 decades of strong U.S. presence. How much will this peace process and perhaps other drawdowns save the Department of Defense? The administration targeted diplomatic reforms that will help to strengthen certain areas and all the while drawing down in the Middle East and areas where we feel we no longer need that presence. What sort of savings can you anticipate?
So it depends on how far the process goes. I think that what we've seen is what we have going on is the best path to a lasting peace in Afghanistan is a negotiated political settlement among the Afghans. This makes that possible. If that continues to go well, we're headed down to 8,600. We could go further below that if this goes further. There are potentially billions of dollars worth of savings that we would achieve through reduced need for operations, reduced need for presence. That all depends on and how this plays out properly. And we're using a condition-based process, but this administration has put an emphasis on being able to emphasize and reprioritize to the China front and to Russia, and these are supportive of that vision.
Thank you, Chairman. I yield.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Chakowski, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Deputy Secretary Norquist. I have been long interested in the cost of private military contractors, and in 2017 report by the Department's Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation Office found that DOD's civilian employees usually cost less than private military contractors. An additional study by the Sustainable Defense Task Force estimated that the department could save over $20 billion per year by scaling back its contractor workforce by just 15%. So I'm just wondering your view of this and what steps, if any, that the department is taking to assess contractors and cost savings.
So this is an important area to look at the balance between what we have in terms of federal employees and contracted support. And it depends, again, on the mix of skills that you need. And I'll just use a simple example, one from my previous job, which is in the audit. Originally in the federal government, we had very little DOD audit experience. All the experience was on the contractor side. So we relied heavily on vendors who understood the accounting standards and experience. Over time, we have reduced that dependence on them and increased the number of federal employees.
Is that a goal?
It's the end of the shift is not a goal. The goal is to make sure that if it is a function best done by the federal government, a perennial function, that's something which you need stability in, we tend to do it with federal employees. If it's a specialized skill, something that rotates in and out, you don't have constant demand, we tend to look to contractors because under those formulas, they're less expensive.
Do you think you have the balance right now?
On the audit side, I think we still have a bit to go. In the others, it depends on each program. It's something we always have to relook because you can't assume that the balance you had last year or 2 years ago or 5 years ago is the right one going forward.
On another subject, according to the Department's 2019 report on effects of changing climate, the Department of Defense said this, quote, "The effect of changing climate are a national security issue with potential impact to the Department of Defense mission, operations, plans, and installation." And the National Security, Military, and Intelligence Panel, checking the time, on climate change, which is made up of current and former defense and intelligence officers, released a report last month that found, quote, "Each region of the world will face severe risk to national and global security in the next 3 decades," unquote, as a result of global climate change. So I want to ask you what the department is doing to adapt current and future operations to address the impact of climate. If you could just give me even just one example of what the department is doing to address this.
Sure, so I'll give you two. The first is on the systems we field, on weapon systems. We have to be able to operate in everything from the desert to the Arctic. So with temperature swings, we have to build systems that have that range of capabilities, deploy them and function in Alaska, bring them down into a desert area. The second is the facilities and the bases. And so when we have bases, they get affected, by hurricanes or other storms. We need to make sure that they have the level of resilience necessary to survive the storms that they are facing. That minimizes the damage and the repair on the other end. So there's been a significant focus on those standards and bringing facilities up to those standards.
And what can Congress do to support the department's effort to combat and adapt to climate change?
I think when you look at the investments we make in our facilities, those are always valuable. And when you look at the range of technologies that we're trying to build to be able to operate in those, support for those investments as well. Thank you.
So are you seeing a decrease in the amount of carbon emissions within the Department of Defense? And what kinds of things can you do to actually help reduce global warming?
So the department looks at a range of energy sources and tries to develop a breadth of them. And again, we tend to focus on the resilience, which is what's our ability to keep the facility up and running when it needs it? How do I have those power supplies? Now, some of them, if you use natural gas, then of course you've got a very different amount of carbon or zero that you're producing compared with other sources. We look at those range of technologies. We attempt to adopt to them in the way most heavily we focus on the facilities.
I thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Deputy Secretary, for coming and for testifying. I'd just like to emphasize what Congressman Johnson mentioned earlier. This committee has not passed a budget, hadn't even come close. Here we are asking questions and some criticizing what the president's budget is when we haven't had anything to put on paper to compare it to. Whether it's a family unit, a business, you have a budget, you have numbers. We just have failed to do that. So I hate that that's the case. Secondly, we're in the middle of a coronavirus. I've heard criticism about funding for a wall. My friends on the left continue to want to let everybody, anybody, anytime in this country, which is really hard for me to believe with the things we're facing on a health crisis in this country, particularly now. But they still hold the opinion, let everybody in, regardless of any type of security problem, which they think really falls way under our climate crisis that they say is above everything. So thank you for coming today. And let me ask you, the congressional budget process is broken. Since fiscal year 2002, the Defense Department has operated under 14 CRs. This is terribly unstable, and it's unsustainable. You elaborated on it some. Can you go into further detail on how tragic this is for what you're trying to do? Not the least, the leases that the military signs that are having to be completely redone and recalculated?
Sure. So I talked originally about you can't do new starts. So let me give an example of a system called IVAS, which is a set of goggles the Army has developed, which uses modern technology and greatly enhances the ability to both train and to perform their mission. The Army did this under an accelerated plan using authorities Congress gave us because Congress said, we want you to innovate. We want you to move quickly. We don't want long bureaucratic processes. And so they acted on that, and they've gone through very rapid prototyping. They've put it in the hands of the soldiers. They've gotten the feedback. They're set to move those into the next stage where there's some procurement that's involved and there's production. But if there's a CR, they're going to need to wait. And they're going to need to wait until we get to the other side of the CR, even with the capability that the men and women in the Army find tremendously valuable and would like to be able to expand on. And you have that when you have the Columbia-class submarine, which would also be a new start. You've got factories waiting on increases in production for things that the department thinks they need, the Congress thinks they need. We're trying to increase the production. That factory is going to be told to wait. Well, anyone knows if you've built a factory to go from 50 to 100 in production and you hold it at 50, you've absorbed overhead costs. You've potentially hired people that aren't able to work on the lines. You're wasting money. And so the challenge we have is these are very disruptive and destructive effects on the Department of Defense. They are disruptive to the men and women in the armed forces, and disruptive to the men and women in the private sector who are working in support of the department and trying to do so efficiently, but can't get a clear business signal from us of whether we're moving or not moving. And that sort of stop and go creates tremendous disruptions throughout the organization.
So even though the Department of Defense is affected, it's a chain supply of those supplying the necessary weapons and the materials. They can't plan because they don't have a timeline, nor do they have the dollars to try to figure out what they're to produce.
I went down to the Anniston Depot and I asked them about their workload and the fact that we had things headed into maintenance. We had a backlog. We needed them to ramp up. And in all seriousness, the person there looked at me and said, well, when will you have an enacted budget? And when you get it, how much will it be for? And the answer is, I don't know. Then he says, then what do you want me to ramp up to? Because it's not just the fact that you're under CR and you don't know what your next number is going to be. Now, the department may have a top line, or there may be some clear agreement, but the funding level for that program is unknown to everybody involved. And so therefore, they live in ignorance until the time of enactment, and that's disruptive, right? Those are the sort of things that the clearer signal, these are costs that we impose on ourselves through the process that we use.
And I think we all can agree China is our number one threat. This just puts us further behind, if we are behind, than we already are.
To the best of my knowledge, they do not have CRs in China.
Correct. Well, thank you for your service. Thank you for appearing today, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing to discuss the President's 2021 defense budget. And thank you, Deputy Secretary, for being here. I have 4 military installations in my district: Nellis and Creech Air Force Bases, the Nevada Test and Training Range, and the Hawthorne Army Depot. President Trump has rerouted billions of dollars in congressionally approved funding for military projects throughout the country to build his unnecessary and ineffective border wall. Can you guarantee that none of the military installations in my districts will have its funding stripped to pay for the border wall?
So my understanding, I don't know if any of them were affected by last year's. I don't know that, I don't think there's nothing to say on the 2808 for this year. We're still awaiting clarity on what's going to happen there.
I would appreciate any advance notice, as it does impact the mission-critical objectives that each of these installations play. Additionally, the Defense Department identified 401 sites as having a known or suspected discharge of toxic chemicals known as PFAS in drinking water or groundwater. Creech Air Force Base was included in that list because firefighting foam that was being used had seeped into the water, contaminating it with its chemicals. This particular issue impacts my constituents and so many other veterans that have served our country. Deputy Secretary, let me tell you about one of my constituents. His name is Kelly Charles. Kelly is 55 years old and was stationed at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina between September 1984 through May 1986, serving as a Marine. The reason that location and time frame will never be forgotten by Kelly is because it is the origin for his development of thyroid cancer as a result of being exposed to contaminated waters. I frequently see Kelly and his wife when I'm back home meeting with veterans that reside in my district. Kelly told me the day he was diagnosed with thyroid cancer was a gut check. It was on his 27th wedding anniversary with his wife and the day they were going to drive to Colorado to be with family for the Christmas season. Kelly was saddened by the news because he knew he would have to tell his children as well. He went to see his endocrinologist the next month after being diagnosed with thyroid cancer and discovered it had been spread to his lymph nodes. When he went to get his thyroid removed, he also had to get a surgical procedure removed to remove 50 lymph nodes and a 2.5 centimeter tumor that had spread tentacles down to some of his shoulder nerves. As a result of these health complications and surgeries, Kelly has constantly had to monitor his health. He has had to take a pill that takes the place of his thyroid gland. He has daily brain fog. He is experiencing anxiety issues, and that's just to name a few. So as I'm sure you're aware, in 2012, the Caring for Camp Lejeune Families Act was signed into law so that veterans who served at Camp Lejeune for at least 30 days between January 1st, 1957 and January 31st, 1987 can have all of their health care expenses, excluding dental, taken care of by the federal government. But we must make sure that we are taking the necessary actions to prevent our service members, like Kelly Charles, from being exposed to contaminated waters. Protecting our military men and women abroad is extremely important, and protecting them here at home is equally as important. So, Deputy Secretary, what is the Defense Department doing today to address issues of contaminated water on military bases throughout the country? And how does your budget reflect the commitment to end the exposure of dangerous chemicals to our servicemen and women?
So thank you, Congressman, for bringing up this very important issue and the attention on the health and serious consequences. This was a matter of great importance to Secretary of Defense Mark Esper. When he came in and was sworn in this summer as Secretary of Defense, his first act was to stand up the task force to deal with PFAS-PFOA. He did that when he first came in. He recognized and shared your concern about the importance, and it's his reliance, it's his emphasis on we need to take care of our military members, their families. As a department, we're doing several things. First and foremost is we're stopping the non-emergency use of these chemicals. We want to make sure we protect the water supply. We are restricting those uses. We're making sure we're treating and testing wells around the installations. We're treating the water so that other people do not drink unsafe water. We're investing in new technologies to let us get past this. But as you point out, this is a serious issue. The department takes it very seriously, and it's a high priority for the Secretary of Defense to address this.
Thank you. I look forward to continuing to work with you on this issue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Holding, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Norquist, good to see you. As you may know, North Carolina considers itself the most friendly state to the military. We have the third largest military presence in the country. Our state is home to Fort Bragg, which is the largest installation by population. We also have Camp Lejeune, New River Air Station, Cherry Point, Pope Air Base, Seymour Johnson Air Base, and Sunny Point Munitions Facility, which I believe is the largest munitions facility in the country. At Fort Bragg, we have the 18th Airborne Corps and the 82nd Airborne Division and the U.S. Army Special Operations Command. So when the President calls 911, he's calling North Carolina. And like you, I never want our men and women to be in a fair fight. I want them to have the best training, the best intelligence, and the best equipment in order to overwhelm any enemy at any time on any battlefield. And a key to this success is their readiness. So if you could speak a bit about readiness and this budget's impact on military readiness.
So I appreciate the question, and readiness is essential. When you talked about the units you have there, many of those are units that have to be able to go on very short notice. And so their readiness levels need to be at the highest level. And so one of the things that we have emphasized over the last several years as we've turned this around is, one, the training, making sure these units have training on schedule at the high level that they need to achieve a level of proficiency, which is unlike what any other force in the world is going to get. So when they walk on the battlefield, everybody knows they're the best. The other part is to make sure they have the most up-to-date equipment and they are trained on it. So as you point out, so there's never a fair fight. That's not what we're interested in. We're making sure they have the right. This also gets to making sure that we have the proper numbers. So as I pointed out before, the end strength of the military had gone down dramatically. I think we're the lowest we had been since 1940. We added 38,000 people. Some of those people went into units to fill them out, so they were closer to the 100% they need to be. Others, like the Air Force, went to be maintainers. Part of their challenge in readiness was keeping their planes up and running because they didn't have maintenance personnel. So they added 4,000 maintainers to try and drive that. Those are some of the key elements, because readiness is really a series of things, as you understand, and we've invested in each and every one of those across the service to make sure that our military is capable of fighting tonight and goes to the battlefield with the better force and the better training at the field.
Thank you. And I would just like to mention that as you look at our military installations and presence around the country, and you consider any realignments, we in North Carolina would welcome more military.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. Jayapal, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome Deputy Secretary back to the committee to speak on the President's $740.5 billion military budget. The sheer size of the budget demands a level of accountability, I think, that we have to take very seriously. Our nation's defense budget is already larger than that of the next 7 countries combined and comprises nearly 35% of the world's total military spending. When you came before this committee last year, we had a conversation about the audit, and I think we agreed on the need for fiscal responsibility and appreciate your efforts around this. As you know, in 2010, Congress passed a requirement within the NDAA that gave the military essentially an extra 7 years to comply with the requirement that every federal agency has to conduct an audit. But we gave the military an extra 7 years to clean up the books and get ready, is how it was described by I think it was Grassley. And we set a deadline of September 2017. In December of 2017, your department began the audit process. And when you came before the committee last year, the Defense Department had failed that first ever agency-wide audit, with only 5 of the 21 individual audits receiving a passing grade, even after 7 years of preparation. This year, only 7 came back clean, a figure that you actually predicted during last year's hearing. Is it acceptable for 2/3 of a $740 billion agency to fail an audit?
So it is not where we want to be, and I think you and I share both a passion for this issue and a frustration with how long it took to get here. One of the things that I agree with you on is this notion of getting ready for an audit without actually having the audit. I don't know about you, but I've never understood. I've never been able to say to GAO, please wait to do your audit till we're ready.
That's right.
In addition to which, you don't have the ability to know if you're ready without the auditors there. So my prior experience at Homeland Security had been where the auditors came every year. We knew our problems, and we knew whether or not we had fixed them. So I think the biggest change we did was move from this notion of we're going to keep spending money to get ready, and the answer is bring on the auditors, bring on the bad news. I mean, truthfully, it's a lot of times people, they're averse to the bad news, and my answer is no. We're not going to get better until you bring the bad news. Let us know who's good. DECA got a clean opinion, our commissaries this year. That's a great step forward. We have other agencies that need to keep going. Now we've got a list of those weaknesses, and we can continue to work through them. So I think it is unacceptable to be here. Part of that is the nature of the systems that we built that were never designed for the audit standards. We're now switching over to ones that are. That you don't want to pour a ton of money into one-time efforts that potentially get you there for 1 year and fall about. We need to be able to have sustainable solutions, better systems, more reliable processes. So again, thank you and the other members for your support of this.
No, and
that's where we're driving towards.
No, I really appreciate that. What's your prediction for how many individual agencies are going to pass their audits this year? You were right last time. What's the prediction?
So I look for 1 to 2 every year to keep moving forward. I think we should, in 5 to 7 years, see the vast majority of them with opinions and clean opinions.
So you think it's going to take 7 years to get a clean audit for a $740 billion agency?
So it took 10 years for the Department of Homeland Security. Now, each year you saw the number of agencies with a clean opinion come down, but the Coast Guard held up the process for, I think, just 5 years on the Coast Guard alone. So the department doesn't get a clean opinion until everybody gets a clean opinion.
Well, and let me just say, I know you share the goal here, but I am frustrated by the idea that we would only get 2 more individual agencies every year, which you said 1 to 2. That seems unacceptable to me. If a major corporation that was worth $740 billion was not able to tell its shareholders where the money was going, that CEO would be out immediately. We wouldn't give them 7 years to get ready and then another 7 years to, actually come back and be able to say how they're spending the money. This is taxpayer dollars that is going into an agency that continues to either not be audited or to fail audits. And it feels like there should be an urgency, especially from somebody like you, who I do believe we share this, an urgency and a push from your level to say, you know what, 2 agencies every year is not sufficient. We have to ramp this up, and we need to get a clean audit for the entire department within, say, 2 years. Right. It just feels unacceptable. And so I'm just asking you to please be more aggressive and to tell me how you're going to get us better than 1 or 2, and you're somebody who agrees with us. So, I need to hear something more from you on that, Deputy Secretary, and how you're going to push for more agencies.
So trust me, this is something I always keep an emphasis on and push on because of our shared concern here. Do keep in mind that we are different in companies. First of all, they were built from the beginning to pass an audit, and we were not. The second
which is an issue in and of itself.
But the other part is, because of the way we get provided money, our audit goes back and can touch 2015 contracts, because those contracts, in fact, they can go back almost 10 years, because if you think of a construction project, the money's available for 5 years, and then for award, and then available for 5 years, and that is legally separate money from this year's appropriation. So the auditors can pull that and say, I want to see the invoice from 2011, and we have to provide it. And so some of the questions these agencies have are, how much time do you want me to spend finding documents from 2011, or should I just accept the fact that that year is going to be a relevant year and focus on getting 2020 correct? So some of this is we got to get the legacy documentation issues have to flow out, and I'm trying to be a little judicious in taxpayers' money, not to launch people on futile efforts. If the answer is, I tell them, are you going to be able to get a clean opinion year after year? No, okay, that's what I want. Don't give me what, how can you do it so you can sustain it? We'll worry about the history part later. But I think this is an area I share. Don't worry, I will keep focusing on it. And let me just highlight for the members here, every time you bring this up, it is valuable. The opening of our hearing with the Armed Services Committee, the chairman opened by mentioning the audit. I don't forget to tell that when I talk to people inside the department,
Well,
to make sure they understand your interest and their support.
That's good. Well, we'll keep being helpful in that way. And I would just say that perhaps the best way to really respect the taxpayers' dollars is to not continue to increase our defense spending until we can show that we are using this money properly and have a full, clean audit. Thank you for your work, Deputy Secretary. I yield back.